Before the dew burned off, the sound was already there. A hoe scraping clay, a screen door slapping shut, a voice 2 yards over calling out that the tomatoes were ahead of schedule. That was the morning news in neighborhoods where the backyard fed more people than the front door ever let in. One crop near the bottom of this list crossed an ocean inside the memory of people who were never meant to keep anything. Another grew so fast that grandmothers left bags of it on porches just to keep up. And the crop at the very top fed more than a family. It fed a people. These were not weekend projects. They were the grocery store, the pharmacy, and the emergency fund, all buried in the same dirt. Hit subscribe because this list goes deeper than dirt. Here are 30 backyard crops Black grandparents grew that fed the whole block. Number 30, garlic. A grandmother pushed cloves into the ground in the fall, forgot about them through winter, and pulled up full heads in the spring without having done a single thing in between. Garlic was the easiest crop in the garden and possibly the most important because it went into everything that mattered. Greens, beans, gravy, anything with smoked meat, anything without smoked meat that needed to taste like it had some. A few dried heads hanging from a nail in the kitchen lasted months. When a child came home with a cold, garlic went into broth. When a pot of soup tasted flat, garlic fixed it before anyone could name what was missing. It never ran out because it multiplied underground. Plant 1 clove, pull up 8. The math alone made it the best deal in the yard. Number 29, mint. Once it took root, it never left. That was the joke and the truth. Grandmothers planted mint along the fence line near the water spigot or beside the back steps, and it spread until someone had to fight it back with a shovel. Nobody bought mint tea from a store. A handful of leaves went into a mason jar with boiling water and enough sugar to make your teeth ache. It settled stomachs, cooled fevers, and gave children something to drink on days when the Kool-Aid ran out. Every porch on the block smelled like it in July. Number 28, poke salad. This was not a salad in any modern sense of the word. Pokeweed grew wild at the edges of every yard, along fence rows and ditch banks, and Black grandmothers knew exactly when to pick it and exactly how to prepare it so it would not make you sick. The leaves had to be young. They had to be boiled at least twice, sometimes 3 times, with the water poured off each round. Raw pokeweed is toxic. Cooked properly, it tasted like a cross between spinach and something earthier that had no name. It cost nothing because nobody planted it. It planted itself. Depression-era families survived on it, and their grandchildren kept picking it long after the Depression ended because the taste reminded them of someone. Number 27, sugarcane. In South Louisiana, South Mississippi, South Alabama, and East Texas, grandparents grew sugarcane in a back row behind everything else, not for sugar production, for chewing. Children stripped the outer bark with a pocket knife and chewed the inner stalk until their jaws ached and their shirts were soaked with juice. That was dessert. That was the candy store. A single stalk could keep 3 children quiet for an hour, and any grandmother who could keep 3 children quiet for an hour understood the value of that crop better than any agricultural report ever written. Pieces were passed across fences to neighbor children without anyone asking permission. The cane belonged to the block. Number 26, sorghum. Where sugarcane could not grow, sorghum took its place. The stalks were pressed at a local mill, often just a man with a mule walking in circles around the press, and the juice was boiled down into a thick, dark syrup that went on biscuits every morning for months. A gallon of sorghum molasses could last a family from September to January. It was spread on cornbread, stirred into oatmeal, and drizzled over butter in a saucer and mixed with the fork until it turned into something children fought over. Families traded jars of it the way people trade business cards now. One crop made enough syrup for the household and 2 neighbors on either side. Number 25. Muscadine grapes. The vines ran along fences, over arbors built from scrap lumber, and up the sides of outbuildings nobody used anymore. Muscadines were thick-skinned, sweet, and impossible to eat politely. You bit the bottom, squeezed the pulp into your mouth, and spit the skin into the grass. Children came home with purple stains on their clothes that never washed out. Grandmothers turned the harvest into jelly, preserves, and homemade wine that sat in the back of a closet in a jar nobody talked about. A good muscadine vine produced for decades. Some of them outlived the people who planted them, still fruiting over a fence in a yard where the house had already been torn down. Number 24, fig trees. Nearly every black grandmother in the Deep South had a fig tree. It was not optional, it was infrastructure. Celeste figs, brown turkey figs, and varieties with no name that came from a cutting off someone else's tree 3 generations back. A mature fig tree produced more fruit than one family could eat, which was the entire point. Figs were shared in brown paper bags left on porches, traded for a ride to church, and preserved in mason jars with enough sugar syrup to keep them through winter. Fig preserves on a hot biscuit was a complete breakfast in houses where breakfast had to stretch. The trees asked for nothing but water and gave back more than the yard could hold. Number 23, peach trees. A peach tree in the backyard meant cobbler in August. That equation never changed. The fruit came in all at once, which meant peeling, slicing, and canning for days straight. Children sat on the back porch with a knife and a bowl and worked until their hands were raw. What could not be canned was given away. What could not be given away was fed to the hogs or left on the ground for the birds. Peach cobbler at a church supper came from somebody's yard. Peach ice cream at a 4th of July cookout came from somebody's yard. The backyard peach tree fed more people than any orchard ever claimed to. Number 22, persimmon trees. These were not grocery store persimmons. These were wild American persimmons, small and wrinkled, hanging from trees that grew at the edge of the yard or just past the property line in a spot nobody else claimed. Picked too early, a persimmon would pucker your mouth shut and teach you patience the hard way. Picked after the first frost, it was one of the sweetest things that grew in the South. Grandmothers made persimmon pudding, a dense, dark, custard-like dish that tasted nothing like any pudding sold in stores. The recipe was rarely written down. It passed from hand to hand the same way the trees passed from yard to yard through cuttings and seeds and a neighbor saying you ought to try one. Number 21, pecans. A pecan tree took years to produce, which meant the tree in the yard was almost always planted by someone who was already gone. Grandchildren harvested what grandparents planted. That was the arrangement. In fall, the nuts dropped and the entire block mobilized. Children were sent out with buckets. Neighbors came with paper sacks. The owner of the tree kept what they needed and gave the rest away, which was still more than enough. Pecan pies, pecan pralines, roasted pecans in a cast iron skillet with salt and butter. A single tree could produce hundreds of pounds in a good year. That fed the block, the church, and whoever showed up at Christmas. What people forget when they romanticize these gardens is that romance had nothing to do with it. Nobody planted okra and tomatoes because they wanted a connection to the land. They planted because the nearest grocery store was across town, charged too much, and stocked whatever the white stores did not sell. The backyard was a direct answer to a system that treated black families as an afterthought. Every row of seeds was a quiet refusal to go without, and the sharing was not generosity in the way magazines describe it. It was engineering. When Mrs. Williams pulled more tomatoes than her kitchen could hold, she walked them to the next porch. When the family at the end of the block had a hard season, somebody else's harvest covered the difference. The block fed itself because nobody else was coming to do it. Number 20, peanuts. The peanut is not native to the American South. It traveled from South America through West Africa and arrived on this continent inside the agricultural knowledge of enslaved people who already understood what it could do. By the early 1900s, peanuts had become one of the most important crops in the region, and the backyard was no exception. Grandmothers grew peanut plants along the edges of the garden in the sandy rows where other crops refused to take, and pulled them up roots and all when the leaves yellowed in the fall. The peanuts hung from the roots like small gifts, caked in dirt, waiting to be washed, boiled, or roasted. Boiled peanuts were a porch ritual. A pot sat on a burner or over a fire for hours, salted heavily, and people walked up and fished them out with their fingers. Roasted peanuts went into everything: peanut brittle, peanut soup in Virginia, peanut butter ground at home long before the sealed jar on the grocery shelf existed. But the peanut did more than feed people. It restored the soil. Cotton had stripped southern land of nitrogen for generations. The peanut put it back. Grandparents who rotated peanuts through their backyard plots noticed the greens grew stronger the following year. That was not guesswork. That was decades of watching the same dirt and remembering what happened. Children on the block walked around with pockets full of raw peanuts the way children today walk around with bags of chips. The difference was that those peanuts came from somebody's grandmother, not a factory. Number 19, watermelon. The watermelon patch took up more space than anything else in the garden, and grandmothers gave it that space because nothing else produced that volume of food from a single vine. A good plant could produce 2 or 3 melons heavy enough that a child could not carry one alone. Watermelon was summer in edible form. It was sliced on newspaper in the yard, eaten standing up, and the rinds were handed to whoever was pickling that week. Because watermelon rinds were pickled. They were preserved in vinegar and sugar and spices and kept in jars alongside the beans and the peaches. Nothing from that garden went to waste, and the watermelon was proof. The flesh was eaten. The rind was pickled. The seeds were dried, roasted, and cracked between teeth on the porch. Number 18, cucumbers. Cucumbers grew fast and produced heavily, which made them the garden's most generous crop and its most exhausting one. A grandmother with 6 cucumber plants had cucumbers coming out of every surface of the kitchen within weeks. They went into jars as pickles. They went into vinegar water with onions and salt as a side dish that showed up at every summer supper. They went to the neighbor's porch in a sack. They went to church in a basket. Growing cucumbers was easy. Getting rid of cucumbers was the hard part. Families traded them for other crops, left them on doorsteps, and still had more than they could handle. Number 17, yellow crookneck squash. This was the vegetable that children either loved or learned to tolerate because it appeared at every meal for 6 straight weeks in midsummer. Fried in a cast iron skillet with onions, it was golden and soft and sweet enough that even the pickiest child stopped complaining. Stewed with tomatoes, it became something closer to a meal than a side. Grandmothers sliced it thin, dredged it in cornmeal, and dropped it into hot grease, and it came out crisp enough to eat with your fingers standing at the counter. The plants produced so aggressively that a single hill could feed a family of 5 with enough left over for the woman across the street. Number 16, tomatoes. A backyard tomato tasted nothing like a grocery store tomato, and every person over 60 knows this without being told. The difference was not subtle, it was enormous. A vine-ripened tomato from the backyard was warm from the sun, so juicy it ran down your wrist, and so flavorful it needed nothing but salt. Some grandmothers ate them like apples, standing between the rows, biting straight into them with a shaker of salt in the other hand. Tomatoes were sliced for sandwiches, stewed for supper, canned for winter, and turned into chow chow relish, with whatever peppers and onions came ripe at the same time. A grandmother's canned tomatoes lasted until February. By March, the family was counting the days until the new plants went in. Number 15, eggplant. Eggplant thrived in the same heat that wilted everything else, which is why grandmothers planted it in the sunniest corner of the yard and let it do what it wanted. The fruits hung heavy and dark and glossy, and a single plant could produce more than a family could eat before they started going soft. Sliced thick and fried in cornmeal, eggplant tasted rich enough to sit next to pork chops without apology. Stewed with tomatoes and onions, it collapsed into something silky that soaked into rice. Some grandmothers pickled the small ones. It was never a glamorous vegetable. It never needed to be. It showed up in the heat, produced without complaint, and fed whoever was home. Number 14, corn. Corn was not one crop, it was 5. Eaten fresh off the cob in summer, it was a side dish. Dried and ground into cornmeal at a local mill, it became the backbone of half the meals that came out of a black kitchen. Cornbread, hoe cakes, hush puppies, cornmeal mush, and the batter that coated everything that went into the fryer. Stalks left standing after harvest became poles for the next year's bean vines. Shucks were used to wrap tamales in Texas, stuff mattresses in Mississippi, and make dolls for children who had no store-bought toys. The cobs themselves were dried and burned for fuel or used to smoke meat. Nothing about the corn plant was wasted because nothing about any of these gardens was wasted. That was not a philosophy, that was math. A family with limited income and a full house does not throw away a corn cob when that corn cob still has a use. Grandmothers dried their own seed corn, selecting the best ears each season and hanging them in a dry place until spring. That practice meant the corn in a family's backyard was not a grocery store variety. It was a variety that had been selected year after year for that specific soil, that specific climate, and that family's specific taste. Some of those backyard corn lines had been maintained for generations. When a grandmother died and no one saved the seed, the variety died with her. That happened quietly, over and over, and each loss was a piece of agricultural history that no university recorded. The corn fed the family, the cornmeal fed the kitchen, the stalks and shucks and cobs fed everything else. It was the most complete crop in the garden. What separated these gardens from what fills lifestyle magazines today is that they were never about one household. The backyard in a black neighborhood was a node in a distribution network that ran on trust and memory. Surplus moved. It moved across chain link fences, down cracked sidewalks, and through church parking lots in the trunks of Sunday cars. A widow whose knees no longer let her bend down to weed still received squash in August because she had handed out squash for 30 years before her body said, stop. A family between paychecks still ate because the man 3 houses down grew more pole beans than his freezer could hold. There was no application, no means test. There was a woman crossing the street with a paper bag full of what she pulled from her own ground, and that was the whole program. Number 13, cabbage. A head of cabbage could feed 6 people for almost nothing, and black grandmothers knew this better than any economist. Cabbage grew in cool weather, which meant it filled the gap between the summer garden and the bare months of winter. It was shredded into coleslaw, braised with smoked meat until it collapsed into something silky and rich, or chopped into soups that stretched a single ham bone into 3 dinners. A head of cabbage was heavy, cheap, and forgiving. It kept on the shelf for days without wilting. It absorbed whatever flavors were put next to it. In a household where nothing was decorative and everything had a job, cabbage was the most dependable worker in the kitchen. Number 12, pole beans. The bean vines climbed up strings, sticks, old broom handles, and anything else a grandmother could push into the ground. By midsummer, the poles disappeared under a wall of green, and picking became a daily task that fell to whoever was closest to the back door. String beans were snapped by hand on the porch, a job given to children and elderly relatives who could sit and talk while they worked. The sound of beans snapping into a metal bowl is a sound that an entire generation carries in their memory. They were cooked slow in a pot with a piece of smoked meat until they were soft and seasoned all the way through. Canned in mason jars, they lasted through winter. Dried on screens, they became leather breeches. Number 11, sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes were not a side dish in a black backyard garden. They were the foundation. A grandmother could hill up a few rows along the south side of the yard in May, and by October, the ground would give back more food per square foot than almost anything else she planted. The vines spread wide and thick, choking out weeds on their own, asking for nothing but heat and loose soil and time. The harvest was an event. Children dug them out by hand, pulling orange roots from the dirt like buried treasure, and a good patch could fill a wheelbarrow in an afternoon. Some went straight to the oven, split open, and eaten with butter. Others got stored in a cool, dark corner of the house, wrapped in newspaper, and they lasted for months. A sweet potato from September was still feeding the family in January. Grandmothers turned them into everything. Candied yams on Sunday, sweet potato pie at Thanksgiving and Christmas, mashed and stirred into biscuit dough when flour was running low, sliced thin and fried in a cast iron skillet for a snack that children fought over. The leaves were edible too, cooked down like greens, though most families had enough greens from other rows and left the vines alone to keep producing underground. Sweet potatoes grew in red clay, sandy loam, and soil so tired that tomatoes would not bother. They fed entire blocks because one grandmother's patch always produced more than one family could eat, and the extras went next door without anyone asking. Number 10, blackberries. Blackberries did not need to be planted. They planted themselves along fence lines, ditch banks, and the edges of yards where the mower could not reach. Picking them was a blood sport. The thorns grabbed clothing, scratched arms, and left marks that lasted a week. Children were sent out with buckets and came back stained from the fingertips to the elbows, carrying more berries in their stomachs than in the bucket. Grandmothers turned the harvest into cobbler, jam, and syrup that went on pancakes and biscuits through winter. A good thicket produced enough fruit for every family within walking distance, and nobody claimed ownership of a blackberry bush. It grew on shared ground or on the line between two properties, and whoever got there first picked what they needed. The berries belonged to the block by default. Number 9, sassafras. Sassafras trees grew at the back edge of the yard or just past it in the scrubby ground between the garden and the woods. Grandmothers dug the roots in spring, scrubbed them clean, and boiled them into a tea that was dark red, fragrant, and sweet enough to drink without sugar if the roots were good. Sassafras tea was the first thing offered to a visitor and the last thing poured at the end of a long afternoon on the porch. The dried leaves were ground into file powder, which went into gumbo in Louisiana and parts of Mississippi as a thickener that no store-bought substitute has ever matched. One tree supplied a household for years. The roots kept coming back, the leaves kept falling, and the tea kept the kitchen smelling like something worth walking into. Number 8, beets. Beets were the crop that stained everything they touched, and nobody cared because the taste was worth the mess. They grew fast in cool weather, came out of the ground heavy and dark red, and went straight into a pot of boiling water until a fork slid through them. Sliced and doused with vinegar, they sat in a jar on the counter and showed up at supper as a side dish that nobody requested and nobody refused. Pickled beets at a church dinner were as certain as the pastor's closing prayer. The greens on top were cooked separately because a grandmother who threw away beet greens was a grandmother who had never been hungry. The root fed the plate, the tops fed the pot. Number 7, pumpkins. Pumpkins sprawled. They took over whatever ground they were given and then took over the ground next to it. The vines crawled under fences, across walkways, and into parts of the yard that had nothing to do with the garden. Grandmothers let them go because a pumpkin vine that wanted to run was a pumpkin vine that was about to produce, and production was the only thing that mattered. A single vine could put out several heavy fruits that sat on the ground through September, turning orange, while the rest of the garden was winding down. When the first cool nights arrived, the pumpkins came inside. Pumpkin was roasted, mashed, and stirred into pies that rivaled sweet potato in every way, but never got the same credit. It was cut into chunks and simmered in soups that stretched a single pot across 3 suppers. It was baked with butter and brown sugar and served as a side dish that children ate without knowing they were eating a vegetable. The seeds were roasted in a skillet with salt. The shells were fed to hogs. Like corn, the pumpkin gave up every part of itself to the household that grew it. But pumpkins also stored. A whole pumpkin, kept in a cool, dry place, could last from October through January without any processing. No canning, no freezing, no electricity required. A crop that stored itself on a shelf in the back room was worth more than its weight. Grandmothers who grew pumpkins were not thinking about carving. They were thinking about February, when the garden was bare and the last pumpkin in the corner was still good enough to feed a family one more time. Number 6, okra. The story of okra in America begins in West Africa, where it was cultivated for centuries before it crossed the Atlantic. It arrived in the New World through the forced migration of enslaved Africans who carried seeds and agricultural knowledge with them across the ocean. That knowledge survived the passage. Okra thrived in the southern heat, growing tall enough to look down on the rest of the garden, producing pods that had to be picked every other day before they got too tough to eat. Fried in cornmeal, it was crisp outside and tender inside. Stewed with tomatoes, it became a one-pot meal. Dropped into gumbo, it thickened the broth and connected the dish to its African roots in a way that no other ingredient could. Grandmothers who grew okra were maintaining a direct agricultural link to a continent most of them had never seen. Number 5, wild plums. Wild plum trees grew in fence rows along property lines and in the strip of land between the yard and the road that nobody mowed. They were small, tart, and came ripe all at once in early summer, which meant a grandmother had about 2 weeks to do something with them before the birds and the heat took what was left. Plum jelly was the most common answer. It was boiled with sugar until it set thick and dark, poured into jars, sealed with paraffin wax, and lined up on a shelf where it glowed like something made of stained glass. Plum jelly on a hot biscuit was a breakfast that cost nothing and tasted like it cost everything. Some families made plum preserves, plum butter, or plum wine that sat in the back of a cabinet and came out at Christmas. The trees were never planted on purpose. They arrived and stayed. Number 4, elderberries. Elderberry bushes grew wild along fence lines, ditch banks, and the shady edges of the yard where nothing else wanted to grow. The clusters of tiny dark berries came ripe in late summer, and grandmothers picked them by cutting the whole cluster and stripping the berries into a bowl. Raw elderberries are bitter and harsh, Cooked into syrup or jelly, they turn sweet and deep and medicinal in the best sense of the word. Elderberry syrup was the remedy that came out when a child had a cold, a cough, or a fever that would not break. A spoonful at bedtime, sometimes mixed with honey and sent to bed with a quilt pulled up to the chin. Some families made elderberry wine. Some dried the berries for winter tea. The bushes asked for nothing and produced enough to dose every child on the block through the worst of winter. Number 3, butter beans. Butter beans grew on low bushes along the back fence, and a grandmother who planted 2 rows in late spring had enough to freeze, can, and give away by August. They came out of the pod pale green and flat, soft enough to cook down in under an hour with a piece of salt pork and a little water. Children sat on the porch shelling them into a bowl, thumbs stained green, and nobody called it a chore because the conversation was the point. A pot of butter beans with rice was a full meal that cost almost nothing, and it stretched far enough to send a plate across the street. They grew back year after year in the same soil, and grandmothers who saved their own seed never had to buy a packet. That made them the most reliable crop in the yard. When the rest of the garden slowed down in the August heat, butter beans kept producing. Number 2, onions. Every dish started with an onion. That was the law of the kitchen, and the backyard supplied the evidence. Yellow onions, white onions, and the small multiplying onions that came back year after year without replanting and split into clusters underground like they were trying to outproduce everything else in the garden. Onions went into every pot of greens, every skillet of fried corn, every pot of beans, and every pan of gravy that ever left that stove. They were the foundation of flavor in a cuisine built entirely on making simple things taste extraordinary. A grandmother without onions was a grandmother without a kitchen. They grew anywhere, tolerated everything, and gave more flavor per square inch of garden space than any other crop on this list. Number 1, rice. Along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, the Gullah Geechee people grew rice in low-lying plots and marshy ground near their homes using techniques that traced a direct line to West Africa. The knowledge of how to flood a small plot, how to thresh the grain by hand, how to winnow it in a sweetgrass basket tossed against the wind, all of it crossed the Atlantic in the memories of people who were given nothing and allowed to keep even less. Rice was the base of every meal. It sat under the peas, the greens, the gravy, and the stew. It stretched one piece of smoked meat into supper for an entire household. A sack of homegrown rice in the corner of the kitchen was the difference between eating and not eating in months when nothing else came through. Every crop on this list fed a family. Rice fed a people. It carried an entire continent's knowledge into this soil, and the grandmothers who tended it made sure that knowledge never went hungry. Number 22, hog head cheese. This is the one that makes people under 40 stop chewing. It was not cheese at all. It was a terrine made from the head of a pig, boiled for hours until every scrap of meat fell from the bone. A woman in Lafayette, Louisiana, learned to make it from her mother, who learned it from hers, going back to a time when a family could not afford to waste a single part of the animal. She pulled the meat apart by hand, mixed it with onion, vinegar, salt, red pepper, and sage, then pressed it into a loaf pan and let the natural gelatin set it firm overnight in the icebox. It sliced like cold cuts. You ate it on saltine crackers with hot sauce. Some called it souse. In Charleston, South Carolina, it was a Christmas and New Year tradition going back generations, connecting black families there to Barbados, where many of their ancestors had first been enslaved. By the 1990s, the younger generation refused to eat it. They did not know its name. Number 18, smothered oxtails with onion. A heavy enamel Dutch oven on a coal range in 1947, Cleveland. 4 pounds of oxtails, dredged in flour, browned on every side. They wore a dark crust. The cook poured off most of the grease, added 2 yellow onions, sliced thick, 3 cloves of garlic, a quart of beef broth from the bones the day before. She covered the pot, slid it to the back of the range, let it braise 4 hours while she did the wash. The oxtails came out fork tender. The gravy was the color of strong coffee. The onions had melted into the sauce. She served it over white rice with stewed collards and a wedge of cornbread fresh from the oven. The dish fed 6 for 35 cents in 1947. That was the whole bill. Your grandfather ate it on Sunday after church, the way his father had before him. It signaled your family had survived another week. Number 25, cornbread crumbled in buttermilk. This was not a recipe. This was what your grandmother ate when she thought nobody was watching. A woman in Selma, Alabama, would take a leftover square of cornbread from the night before, crumble it into a tall glass of cold buttermilk, and eat it with a long spoon while standing at the kitchen counter. No plate, no fuss, just cornmeal and tang. In the 1950s, buttermilk was cheap. You could get a quart for less than 15 cents in most parts of the rural South. The cornbread was already made, already paid for. This was a breakfast that cost almost nothing and took less than a minute to prepare. Some women added a pinch of salt. Others added nothing at all. The cornbread soaked up the buttermilk and turned soft, almost like a pudding. Children in rural Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia grew up watching their grandmothers eat this standing at the sink before dawn. By the 1980s, it was gone from most kitchens. Your grandmother did not call it a recipe. She called it Tuesday, number 21, poke salad. This was a dish that came from the woods, not from a store. Pokeweed grew wild across the South along fence lines and ditches and the edges of cotton fields. A woman in rural Alabama in the 1950s could walk out her back door and fill a grocery bag with poke leaves in 20 minutes. But the plant is toxic if you do not cook it right. The leaves had to be boiled 3 separate times, with the water thrown out each time to remove the poison. After the 3rd boil, the greens were safe. She would fry them in bacon grease with onion and scrambled eggs. It tasted like a cross between spinach and asparagus, with a bitterness that the pork fat softened. The whole dish was free. Every ingredient either grew wild or came from your yard. It was simple, it was healthy, and it was alive with a flavor you could not find in any store. By the 1980s, people stopped foraging. Grocery stores replaced the ditch, and the knowledge of which plants could feed you and which ones could kill you disappeared with the generation that walked those fields. Number 23, chicken neck stew with rice. A Memphis butcher in 1942 sold chicken necks for a nickel a pound, sometimes gave them away on Saturday night. The case had to be empty by Monday. She bought 4 pounds, simmered them in salted water with 1 onion and 3 peppercorns for 2 hours. The meat slid off the bone, the broth ran cloudy, the rice cooked in the Potlikker, no extra water. The necks went on top to keep warm. She stripped the meat with 2 forks at the table while the children watched and learned. That was how every Memphis cook taught her daughter. The dish fed 7 for 30 cents. The Memphis paper printed it next to a war bond ad and a coupon for canned milk. In those years, nobody threw away the necks. By 1968, the supermarket sold whole chickens, cheap enough that nobody bothered. The butcher case stopped stocking them around 1974. Year after year, the cut got harder to find. You can't even ask for them today. Number 23, tomato gravy over biscuits. If you grew up in the deep South, you know that gravy did not always come from meat. A woman in rural Georgia in the early 1950s would fry a little bacon, pull it from the pan, then add flour and a can of stewed tomatoes to the drippings. She stirred it over heat until it thickened into a reddish gravy that she poured over split biscuits. This was one of those breakfasts that existed because of what a family did not have. If there was no sausage, no ham, no eggs, there was almost always a can of tomatoes and a little flour. The gravy had a tang to it, a slight sweetness from the tomatoes that made the biscuits taste like something more than bread. In parts of Mississippi, they called it red gravy. In parts of Florida, they called it poor man's gravy. Your grandmother probably did not call it anything. She just made it and set it on the table. That was enough. Number 24, stewed tomatoes and okra. This was West Africa on a plate, and most people at the homecoming table did not even know it. Okra came to North America in the braids and pockets of enslaved women who carried seeds from their homeland across the Atlantic. A woman in Savannah, Georgia, picked okra from her garden every August and cooked it down with tomatoes, onions, salt, pepper, and a little sugar to cut the acid. She let it simmer on the stove for nearly 2 hours until the okra broke down into a thick, silky sauce that clung to a spoon. She served it over white rice. The dish cost almost nothing to make. It was simple and it was effective. A pound of okra in 1968 cost about 15 cents at a roadside stand in rural Georgia. But by the 1990s, fresh okra was harder to find in your neighborhood, and younger cooks did not want to deal with the slime. They had never learned that slow cooking was the answer. That knowledge left with the gardeners. Number 25, salt pork and cabbage pot, a blue speckled enamel pot on a wood range in 1943 Birmingham, 3/4 full of water, 1 head of cabbage chopped rough, a piece of salt pork the size of a child's fist. The cook cut the rind into a cross so the fat would render slow. By the time the cabbage went limp, the pork had given up enough grease to coat every leaf. The kitchen smelled the vinegar from the porch jar she kept by the door. 4 ingredients, 1 fire, a wooden spoon worn smooth from 20 years of use. None of it was banned by law. The supermarket just stopped stocking the rind by 1972. She served it with a wedge of corn pone and a glass of cold buttermilk on the side. Your grandmother knew the dish by smell. Her grandmother had cooked it through the Depression. You have never tasted it. Your kitchen does not even keep the pot anymore. Number 22, buttermilk biscuits with cane syrup. In the 1950s, a lager cane syrup was a staple on black breakfast tables across the South. Women in Mobile, Alabama, would pull a pan of biscuits from the oven, split each one open, lay a pat of butter inside, and pour a ribbon of dark cane syrup over the top. That was the whole breakfast. Some mornings, just biscuits and syrup. The Alaga brand was so popular in black households that the company marketed directly to African American communities for decades. A bottle cost about 20 cents in 1955. The syrup was thick, dark, and had a deep sweetness that refined sugar could not match. Children soaked their biscuits until the bread was almost translucent. The syrup pooled on the plate and you used your finger to get the last of it. This was not poverty. This was simple. This was a woman turning flour and sweetness into something her children remembered for the rest of their lives. They were following a memory. Number 23, chicken gizzards. If you grew up in a house where nothing was wasted, you knew what a gizzard was. It is a muscular part of a chicken's digestive system, tough as leather when raw, but when cleaned properly and fried to a deep golden brown, it had a chew and a crunch that no other part of the bird could match. A woman in Jackson, Mississippi, bought gizzards by the pound at the butcher counter for 20 cents in 1965. She boiled them first until they were tender, then dredged them in seasoned flour and dropped them into a skillet of hot oil. Children at the homecoming table ate them like candy. Some women simmered gizzards in gravy instead and served them over rice. Either way, the dish was proof that Black cooking wasted nothing. Your grandmother did not throw away what she could transform. That was the whole philosophy. Number 22, pig feet, jelly with hot vinegar. A glass mason jar on the back porch shelf in 1945 Charleston, packed with split pig feet, water, salt, bay leaf, and 3 cloves of garlic. She simmered the feet for 6 hours. The meat fell off. The broth turned the color of weak tea. She strained it, pressed the meat into the jar, let the natural collagen do the work. By morning, the whole thing had set into a pale amber jelly. She sliced it cold for supper, served it with hot pepper vinegar in a thin saucer, a stack of saltine crackers on the side. A man came in from the field, ate half the jar, asked for more. The dish needed no icebox in winter. Your grandmother could feed a working man on what the white grocer threw away. That was the genius of her Depression kitchen. You wouldn't think a foot could become supper, but it could. Number 20, vinegar pie. This was the desperation pie that Black families baked when there was no fruit in the house and no money to buy lemons. A woman in East Texas in the 1940s made this pie with 5 ingredients: eggs, sugar, butter, flour, and a splash of apple cider vinegar. That was it. The vinegar cut through the sweetness and mimicked the tartness of a lemon pie so closely that children eating it for the first time could not tell the difference. It baked into a custard filling inside a lard crust that shattered when you pressed a fork through it. The pie was born during the Depression, but Black families had been making versions of it long before that in kitchens where citrus was a luxury that never arrived. It cost less than a dime to make. By the time grocery stores stocked year-round lemons in the 1970s, there was no reason to reach for the vinegar anymore, and nobody wrote the recipe down because nobody thought it was worth saving. It was. Number 17, fried bologna and biscuit sandwich. A round of red rind bologna on the butcher counter in 1944 Pittsburgh, 20 cents a pound. The War Ration Board rewrote the rules every other Tuesday. She cut 4 thick slices, scored each one with an X to keep it from puffing, laid them in a hot iron skillet with a teaspoon of bacon grease. The edges curled into little cups that held the grease. The centers turned the color of a warm brick. The biscuits were buttermilk, baked that morning in the same skillet. She split them, laid the fried slice on the bottom half, pressed the top down so the grease soaked through. A coal miner ate 2 for breakfast and a third in his lunch pail wrapped in waxed paper. That was breakfast. The sandwich cost 5 cents in 1944. Your grandfather carried one like it into the coal seam every morning. It was the shift food of every miner from Pittsburgh to Beckley. The dish disappeared by 1980 when the bologna lost its red rind. Number 19, smothered liver and onions. Back then, this was the dish that separated the women who could cook from the women who just heated things up. A woman in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, soaked sliced calf liver in buttermilk for an hour to pull out the bitterness. She dredged each piece in seasoned flour and fried it fast in a hot skillet until the outside was crisp, but the inside stayed pink and soft. Then she piled sliced onions on top, added a splash of water, and covered the skillet until those onions melted down into something sweet and golden. She served it over white rice with a side of cornbread. The liver cost 40 cents a pound in 1969. The whole meal fed 6 people for under $2. Children wrinkled their noses at the sight of it. But then they took a bite and something shifted. It was not about preference, it was about presence. It meant someone had worked with what she had and still managed to put something hot and healing on the table. Here is what most people do not talk about when they remember homecoming dinners. The women who cooked these meals were not following trends. They were following a budget. Every dish on that table was an act of mathematics. How many mouths, how many dollars, how many hours until the food had to be ready. Liver was cheap because nobody in the grocery store wanted it. Onions were cheap because they grew in every garden. And the women who turned those two ingredients into something that tasted like someone loved you were doing work that no restaurant could replicate. They were not trained, they were not paid, they just showed up every homecoming Sunday and fed people with whatever the week had left them. That was not cuisine, that was engineering. Number 24, hoe cakes with sorghum molasses, a black iron griddle on a kerosene stove in 1944 Tuskegee, smoking hot, bacon grease pooled in the center. The batter was cornmeal, salt, hot water, nothing else. She dropped it by spoonful, 3 at a time, waited for the edges to lace, flipped each round. Each cake came off the size of a saucer, crisp brown skirt, soft yellow heart. The sorghum sat in a tan pitcher on the table, slow and dark as tar. A child got 2 and was full. A working man got 6 and was satisfied. Your grandmother made these the way her mother had during the Depression. A sack of cornmeal lasted you a family 2 weeks. The supper cost 8 cents in 1944. By 1965, the kerosene stove was gone. The hoe cake went with it. You won't find it on any menu now. 30 crops, no delivery app, no subscription box, no barcode on any of it. Just a stretch of dirt behind the house and a woman who made sure her block never went without. These gardens are quieter now. Some have been paved over for parking spots that serve nobody. But the seeds are not gone. They are folded into envelopes in kitchen drawers, tucked inside Bibles, passed hand to hand at family reunions where somebody always brings a cutting wrapped in a wet paper towel. Grow one thing from this list this year, then do what your grandmother did with the extra. Walk it next door. Drop the crop your family grew in the comments. The name is enough. Everybody who grew up with it will know exactly what you mean.